And with that, I would now, Madam Speaker, like to yield to my friend, the gentleman from Maryland, the House Majority Leader.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Madam Speaker, on Tuesday, the House will meet at 12 p.m. for morning hour debate and 2 p.m. for legislative business, with votes postponed until 6:30 p.m. On Wednesday and Thursday, the House will meet at 10 a.m. for morning hour debate and 12 p.m. for legislative business. On Friday, the House will meet at 9 a.m. for legislative business, and last votes of the week will be expected no later than 3 p.m. We will consider several bills, Madam Speaker, under suspension of the rules. The complete list of suspension bills will be announced by the close of business tomorrow. The House will also consider H.R. 397, the Rehabilitation for Multi-Employer Pension Act, commonly referred to as the Butch-Lewis Act. The 10 million Americans who have paid into multi-employer pensions deserve to know they will receive the benefits they've earned when they retire. The bill will help ensure a secure retirement for these workers and retirees. In addition, Madam Speaker, the House will consider H.R. 2203, the Homeland Security Improvement Act. This legislation, introduced by Congresswoman Escobar, will ensure that the Department of Homeland Security addresses border issues in a responsible and humane manner. The bill fosters greater accountability when it comes to the handling of children and migrant families at all levels within the Department of Homeland Security. The House is also expected to consider additional legislation, Madam Speaker, related to the current humanitarian crisis on the southern border. Members are advised that the additional legislative items are expected. As you know, it's the last week before we adjourn, and there is an effort to try to get things done that can, in fact, be done within the time frame we have available to us. It is my sincere hope that an agreement is reached to reach the budget cap and the debt limit. The Speaker and Secretary Mnuchin and others have been working very hard on this objective, and I'm hopeful that they will reach an agreement that we can agree on as a House and as a Senate. And we will consider that, assuming an agreement is reached, we will consider that as soon as they reach it, and hopefully that will be next week. And I yield back to my friend from Louisiana.
I thank the gentleman for giving that update on the schedule. I know that we have been in talks on a budget caps agreement, met with the Vice President earlier this morning talking through some of the things that may be included. Obviously, there's no final agreement, and we would hope that those talks go on, hopefully reach an agreement where we can give real certainty, especially to our Department of Defense, that you look at what sequestration would do to defense as we've been able to rebuild our defense over the last 2 years. We'd like to see that progress continue, but a lot of other issues are at stake there, and we encourage those talks to move forward, and we will be ready to move if there is an agreement reached between all of the parties, including the White House. I did not hear mention of anything regarding the BDS legislation. We've heard that there might be some movement on standing up against the BDS movement. I know that when we looked at a number of bills, there's some resolutions that are out there, some good, some bad, but as we know, there's time for talk and then there's time for action, and the resolutions are only talk. The legislation, H.R. 336 by Mr. McCall, is the only bill out there as S1 moved through the Senate with a large, overwhelming bipartisan vote. Similar legislation that would actually put teeth, not just words, which are important, but words followed up with action, real teeth to help not only this country, but our states that are also standing up against the BDS movement, to give them some muscle, some ability to stand up to the BDS movement. I would ask the gentleman, is there any indication that there might be movement on H.R. 336 to actually follow up the words with real action against the BDS movement? And I would yield.
In response to my friend, Madam Speaker, I will tell him that the committee did, in fact, mark up bills this past Wednesday, yesterday, and those bills are being looked at to possibly move to the floor.
And specifically, if I could ask my friend, H.R. 336 was not one of those bills that was marked up. The only bills that were marked up were resolutions. And again, while some of those resolutions might have some good language in them. There's no actual teeth. There's no policy. There's no change in law to give us more tools as a country to stand up to the BDS movement, to defend our friend Israel, because as we know, the BDS movement really is rooted in anti-Semitism to undermine Israel's economy, which none of us should want to see. I know my friend doesn't want to see Israel's economy undermined, but there's a movement to do that. And if we're going to truly stand up against it, words are not enough. We need action. In H.R. 336, again, it reflects similar legislation that passed the Senate with an overwhelming vote, overwhelming Republicans and Democrats coming together to give real tools to stand up to this movement and support our friends Israel. Would that bill be considered, because it was not part of the package of bills that were brought up in committee this week?
Again, I would tell my friend, as he has articulated, that bill has not been marked up in committee. There are two bills that were marked up in committee, and there is a possibility that we will consider those. But the other bill was not marked up.
Okay, again, and I appreciate my friend yielding back, but I would just encourage that we go back and look. This committee can do better. If we're going to stand up against this movement, support our friend Israel against this attempt to undermine their economy, we need real tools. And H.R. 336 is the only instrument out there. S1, we'd love to see S1 pass. There have been questions raised about whether or not it's got an origination problem. So that's why H.R. 336 was filed. But again, H.R. 336 is the same language that passed with 77 votes in the Senate. 77 votes. Overwhelming Republicans and Democrats coming together. I would encourage us to follow that lead of bipartisanship, standing with Israel. And I'm disappointed that it's not included in the package that moved out of committee. I would hope we would go back and consider bringing that bill to the floor. Again, words are nice, but words without action don't give us the tools we need to stand with our friend Israel against this undermining attempt known as BDS. With that, I would yield if the
Let me
gentleman
just
had
make
anything
a comment. I appreciate the gentleman's comments. Unfortunately, of course, three of the component parts of the bill to which the gentleman refers we are strongly for. Unfortunately, they were held up in the Senate, as the gentleman may know. We want to see the MOU for Israel assistance package, which we strongly support, which was negotiated by the Obama administration, and which we strongly support in terms of the amount of money available, not only on a general basis, but also the specific basis for support of Israel's defense against rockets and other munitions that would be sent into Israel. We also support the Syria sanctions and the Jordan MOU, so we hope at some point they will move. As I will reiterate, however, there have been two bills marked up, and the possibility of considering those for next week is there.
And thank you. Clearly, if there are issues that need to be worked out, differences that might exist between the chairman and the lead Republican on the committee, that work needs to be done. There have been no indications given to us of some counter offer, some different way to do it, some better way to do it than what is in H.R. 336. But again, that language in 336 is the same language that was in S1 that passed the Senate with a 77-23 vote. Doesn't mean that the Senate has the best idea, but it shows that there was a way that Republicans and Democrats could come together to stand with Israel against this movement. If there's a better way to do it, we would be more than happy to work through those better ideas, but none of those better ideas have been presented to us. They've just shut down that bill. They've shut down the ability to have a bill come to the floor to actually put teeth in law to give us more tools. I would just urge that if there's a better alternative that the chairman of the committee or the leadership on your side has, please present that and let's negotiate it, but none of that has been presented up until now. And so I would just encourage us to do better as we try to give more support to our friend Israel against this growing movement. With that, I would like to ask about the agenda as we've seen it so far and the decorum. The agenda we've seen this week alone, multiple pieces of legislation, whether it's targeted at the president. We had a resolution on the president's tweet. There was a resolution filed to impeach the president of the United States. There was a resolution to hold Trump officials in contempt of Congress with no basis for that contempt. There were multiple resolutions just this week to go and target and harass different policies of the administration. There is so much legislation that we ought to be on this floor debating to do things that would actually help real families. There is a crisis at our border, and there's been no bipartisan legislation. The bills that are going to be coming to the floor next week that the gentleman mentioned dealing with Homeland Security are known by many in the Homeland Security field as the Open Borders Bill, not a bipartisan approach to solving our problem at the border. We need a secure border. We need to solve the crisis at the border, fix our broken asylum laws. We want to encourage asylum to work. There ought to be a way to apply for asylum, but in all honesty, if somebody goes through other countries and turns down asylum in those countries and comes here and just reads a script because they know there's a loophole in our law, we ought to work together to fix those broken loopholes. And the things that are causing an overwhelming crisis at our border, that's not been done. Bills to lower drug prices. We had a bipartisan agreement in committee in Energy and Commerce to lower drug prices, and yet that was abandoned when that bill came to the floor and sent in a way that became a partisan bill. These shouldn't be partisan issues. I would hope that we would move away from the harassment agenda, get back to an agenda that's focused on Republicans and Democrats working together, not in a partisan way to say, hey, we passed some bill out of the House that everybody knows is going nowhere because it was a partisan approach. Look at what the Senate's done to move bipartisan bills through their chamber. We can do the same. We can do better than the Senate, but we're not. And when the Speaker breaks the House rules, when you see this breakdown, it just raises the ire because there is not that attempt to work in a bipartisan way to solve these problems. And there are a lot of good ideas that are bipartisan to solve these problems. The disappointment is that we don't see those coming to the House floor. The bills that deal with real policy coming to the House floor are only brought, by and large, from a partisan perspective. And the bipartisan approaches are being discarded. And BDS is one clear example where there's a way to solve the problem, where Republicans and Democrats came together, and even from the gentleman's acknowledgement, there's no indication that it's going to move out of committee anytime soon. And it ought to be out of committee. It ought to be on the House floor so that we can not only debate it, but pass it and get a bill to the president's desk to allow us to stand up more against the BDS movement and in support of Israel. And I would yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. First of all, let me say that two things. We are confronting, in my view, an unprecedented refusal of an administration to cooperate with the Congress in the exercise of its constitutional duties. I refer specifically to the issuance of subpoenas either for testimony or for documentary evidence, so that the Congress can properly exercise its oversight responsibilities under the Constitution. I have been here for some almost 4 decades, and I have never seen any administration essentially direct across the board no response to the Congress of the United States or to its committees. So yes, we are pursuing. The gentleman referred to the contempt citation dealing with Mr. Barr and Mr. Ross. Now, the issue at center of that, as the gentleman knows, the administration ultimately decided it would not pursue the policies that were the subject of that investigation. However, it is not about the specific, but it is about the general constitutional responsibility that this Congress has to the American people. We ask for information not on behalf of ourselves individually, but on behalf of the American people, so they will know what their government is doing. There will be a transparency to the operations of government, and they will be able to determine whether or not any administrative official or the administration generally is acting on its behalf personally, or whether it is acting on behalf of the American people. So from that perspective, I think the resolutions that we have offered, of which there essentially have been two dealing with this issue, and maybe more, if the refusal to cooperate with subpoenas is continued, so that I hope that the gentleman will understand that we are trying to protect the responsibilities and authority of the Congress of the United States, the people's body, the Article I body, to do its duty properly. Secondly, yes, we did have a very difficult day yesterday. But I will tell you, my friend from Louisiana, I think it is the absolute responsibility of this body to respond if it sees things that are being done by the administration or by others that it perceives to be contrary to the ideals of this country, contrary to the declaration that we believe that all men and, yes, all women are created equal, contrary to the extraordinary, wrenching war that we had among the states to determine that all were equal, and a construction period. And then, as I grew up in the 1950s and 60s, looking racism in the face and saying we reject it, that we reject racism, we reject prejudice, we reject simplifying if people are a certain color or a certain race or a certain nationality or a certain gender, that somehow they're less than other Americans. I think it is our responsibility to confront that. And that's what we did yesterday. It was difficult, I understand. I was sorry that it was not a bipartisan vote, because I don't believe that members on your side of the aisle want to tolerate racism any more than we want to tolerate racism. And if we see it, I think we have a responsibility to speak out, to stand up, to say this is not right in America. This is not America. So yes, we had a resolution yesterday that was, the gentleman refers to in response to a tweet. It was not the tweet, it was what the tweet said, what it implied, what it diminished in terms of America's sense of decency and equality and tolerance and inclusion for our people. Now, let me go to legislation. As the gentleman knows, we passed substantial pieces of legislation. We passed H.R. 1. No Republicans voted for that, but it seeks to make it easier for people to vote in America, make sure their vote is protected and counted. It made sure that we have transparency in the financing of campaigns. It made sure that our redistricting was fair to our citizens, and that we politicians were not drawing the districts, but that the districts are drawn in fairness to the American people. It also demanded ethics performance. But then we passed an anti-hate resolution. It was just words, but it was said no to hate. 173 Republicans voted for that, overwhelmingly passed bipartisan. We passed a land and water conservation fund that made that fund permanent. A very important bill for a state like Louisiana and, frankly, my own state of Maryland, who are all surrounded by water, have a lot of water. That bill got 133 Republicans. It languages is still in the Senate. We passed the Secure Act, which makes it easier for people to get retirement security. That was supported by 187 Republicans. We passed the Violence Against Women Reauthorization. Now, unfortunately, it didn't get an overwhelm, but it got 33 Republicans voting for it. It languishes in the Senate. We passed a provision that said we want to protect pre-existing conditions in the Affordable Care Act. We got 8 Republicans. I would have wished we'd gotten more. We passed disaster relief. The gentleman knows a lot about disaster relief, very important to his state. Unfortunately, we only got 34 Republicans, but it was a bipartisan bill. So we've also passed background checks, which are supported by 90% of the American people, to try to make gun violence lessened in the United States of America. Now, for that bill, we only got 8 Republicans, but those 2 bills, supported by 90% of the American people, languishes in the United States Senate. The Majority Leader not bringing up that legislation. We passed a national emergency resolution which said, Mr. President, you can't take money that we appropriated for X and just send it over to Y. That was, I thought, a protection of our constitutional authority. The Constitution says we raise and we spend money, and we direct the executive. We direct the executive on how to do that. That got 13 Republicans supporting it, major piece of legislation. And we passed a DREAMer legislation. We've been asking for that legislation for almost a decade, or at least 6 years, I should say. And that legislation got no vote over the last 5 years. It got a vote this year, and we got a number of Republicans, 7 to be exact, to vote for that. Now, I could go through a number of other pieces of legislation, including, lastly, the minimum wage bill. This was about capitalism, not socialism. We're capitalists over here. We believe in the free market system over here. And any assertion to the contrary, Madam Speaker, is absolutely false. It is a good political tactic. It's a scare tactic, Madam Speaker, but I reject it out of hand. We believe in the free market system. We believe the free market system has been the system that has provided the most benefits for the broadest number of people. We believe that's one of the great facets of our democracy, our free market system. And I will tell, Madam Speaker, my friend, that it was Democrats in the 1930s that saved the free market system. It was Democrats in December of '07 that came in and made sure that the free market system did not crash after 8 years of Republican leadership. 7 years, 8 years, December '07. And I would hope that the gentleman would not make the assertion that surely he knows is not true, Madam Speaker, that we on this side are looking to support a socialist agenda. We are promoting and continue to promote a socially sensitive agenda for the American people to make sure that they have health care. Medicare was called a socialist program, Madam Speaker, when it was adopted. That is a program that millions and millions of Americans rely on and have been brought out of poverty. Medicare was called a socialist program when it was adopted. That program, combined with Medicare, has millions of Americans having a sense of security, a sense of independence, a sense that they are not going to fall through the cracks. So we ought not to be debating, I say, Madam Speaker, this phony shibboleth of socialism. The minimum wage is simply saying, in America, we value people who work. And we want to ensure that people who work are not living in poverty and have some ability to support themselves and their families in a decent way. We passed that bill today. We're proud of passing that bill. Very frankly, 10 years of Republican control of the House of Representatives, we pleaded with them to bring a minimum wage bill of whatever number to the floor. And they didn't bring a single cent raise in a decade. The longest time since the minimum wage was adopted in the 30s, to make sure that Americans were lifted out of that deepest recession that this country's never had. So I say to my friend, we've done a lot. I wish the Senate would move it. Let me close because I'm very proud of, I'll close in terms of this response. I'm very proud of this. We have passed 10 appropriation bills out of 12, the most since '06. Now, '06, you were in charge. Not you personally, Madam Speaker, the Republicans, I don't refer to the gentleman personally, but the Republicans were in charge. And they didn't bring the labor health bill to the floor. I'm not sure why, but I had offered a minimum wage increase in that bill, in the Labor Health Committee, and they never brought it to the floor. It passed in committee, even though the Republicans were in charge and the majority of members in the committee were Republicans. But that minimum wage increase passed, but they refused to bring it to the floor. I can only conclude that they're not for increasing the minimum wage. We disagree with that position. We believe that in America, if you're working, playing by the rules, and making our economy grow, then you ought to be paid a wage that you can survive on. And better than that, live on. And so I'm proud of the legislation that we passed, and I'm proud of the 10 appropriation bills, which, by the way, fund 96% of the government. Our colleagues in the Senate, Madam Speaker, have not passed a single appropriation bill through committee, not one. So we're doing our job, Madam Speaker, and we are addressing the issues of the American people. I agree 100% with the minority, with the Republican whip, that we need to deal with drug pricing. We pledged to do that. We're working together. The President says he wants to do that. Hopefully we can get to consensus. I agree with the gentleman from Louisiana, Madam Speaker. We haven't gotten there yet. Hopefully we can get there. Hopefully we can strengthen the Affordable Care Act so that people will have the confidence that it will be available to them. And with that, I know that was a relatively, maybe not relatively, a long answer, but I think we have done a lot of work. I'm very proud of the 6 months that we have had, or a little over, well, 6 months. We spent the first 35 days trying to open up government. This is the first Congress in the history of the United States in which the government was shut down when the new Congress started. Now, it's been shut down before, but this was the first time when we started. It took us 35 days to get that open, and when we did get it open, we started on an agenda of which I'm proud. Do we have more work to do? We do. And Madam Speaker, we intend to continue an agenda that does that work. And I yield to my friend.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. And there's clearly a lot to cover there. But, let's start with the big debate, and that is what the gentleman alluded to, and that is government control versus freedom. Because that's going to be the debate over the next year, where there's already a presidential primary debate process going on. And, when you see every candidate for president on one side saying that they want to give free health care benefits to people that are here illegally, yet many of them embrace a plan that would literally end private insurance for families that enjoy the health care plans they have in the private marketplace, the Medicare for All proposal. There are so many different areas where we see this debate about government control versus freedom. And yes, to the gentleman, there are some on your side who refer to themselves as socialist Democrats. And so if they want to call themselves that, then at least own the things that go with socialism and recognize the damage that's done by socialism. And to think that any one party has some kind of ownership of capitalism in the free market system, I'd be more than happy to see us engage in a debate about capitalism, because there's some on the other side that attack it on a regular basis. But if you look at how Republican policies have gotten us to where we are with the most booming economy in the world, our economy is the envy of the world. People's wages are rising. Low-income people, in fact, are benefiting the most. And you're seeing the increase in the rebuilding of our middle class that was evaporating because of 8 years. For 8 years in a row under the previous administration, every single quarter, our economy had less than 2% growth for 8 years in a row. The economy wasn't even that bad during the Great Depression. that the gentleman cited. And so when we came in with a Republican majority and a Republican president, we were able to pass actual policies like the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, like reversing so many of the radical regulations that we saw that had nothing to do with health and safety, but had to do with carrying out an agenda to shut down industries in this country, like the fossil fuel industry and so many others that are providing not only jobs, lower carbon emissions, dominance in the world, helping our friends around the world, lowering energy prices for families in America. Those policies have actually been increasing wages for lower income people, not government-controlled prices, as was passed today, where the government is going to try to come in and set artificial rates for what people ought to make, as opposed to letting this great market that's working incredibly well to raise wages for families. And we've seen the studies. We've seen this, the University of Washington study was cited today, where we can look at real examples of communities that have had artificially high minimum wages, like Seattle, where they put in place a $15 minimum wage. It sounds great. The government's going to set everybody's rates and tell everybody how much they're going to make. And what it resulted in is over 5 million hours lost for workers. In fact, the lower income families in Seattle were hurt the most by that policy by a margin of 3-1. It damages low income families. You know, and again, it might sound good that the government's going to tell everybody what they can make. Most of us that believe in the free market system reject that idea that we should set policies that are crushing jobs in America. There's a bar in New York that was closed because of the increase in the minimum wage that one of our colleagues used to work at. Closed because of an artificially set price minimum wage in the city of New York. And so when you look at jobs that are fleeing some communities and going to other communities, that ought to tell you how those policies are working. But we have a growing economy, not because we had a lot of government control out of Washington, but in fact, because we allowed freedom. We allowed people to keep more of what they earn. We allowed people to make their own choices. And it's a successful formula. We want to see more of it. Now, if we can get into the issue of the harassment agenda, the subpoenas, the finding people in contempt, let's talk about Secretary Ross and the work that was done to comply with the committee's requests. If you look, and this is reading from a document sent by Secretary Ross and Attorney General Barr to the committee, quote, "The department's engagement with the committee is a good faith accommodation process is rooted in the separation of powers. As part of that process, both departments have made multiple witnesses available for voluntary transcribed interviews and have produced more than 30,000 pages of documents to the committee. Before the committee abruptly and prematurely terminated the accommodation process last month, the Department of Justice intended to provide a significant number of additional documents identified as responsive to the committee's subpoena." They go on to talk about how they were complying with the committee, again, producing over 30,000 pages of documents just related to the census. And then the committee abruptly decides they want to just hold them in contempt because there were some documents they wanted that the Attorney General would have actually broken the law if he turned them over. And so you saw a department complying and going overboard to ensure that the separation of powers and the oversight that existed would continue. Of course, when we were in the majority and the previous administration of the other party was there, we had a lot of oversight hearings exercising our Article 1 powers, as we all should, but we didn't go week after week. I mean, just this week alone, a resolution condemning the president's tweets, an impeachment resolution, a resolution to hold 2 cabinet secretaries in contempt, 3 resolutions of disapproval on policy. That was just this week. The American people don't want to see us fighting over power. They want to see us fighting for their needs, the needs of hardworking families. And again, I identified so many things. And just to finish up on the resolution that was discussed earlier, and the gentleman said we need to respond to things that violate this country's principles. First of all, we reject racism wholeheartedly. We reject hate. We reject anti-Semitism. There have been comments made by members of the Gentleman's Party that have not been addressed on this floor that violate those principles. You know, we can all bring resolutions broadly stating things, but if the intention is to identify people by name, it's rather conspicuous that when people of the other party say those things, they're not addressed on this floor by name. And so we know that happened. Again, the way that the Speaker violated the rules of the House, and then a vote was brought to this floor to basically say that those rules don't apply to the Speaker. And if the rules don't apply to the Speaker, then who do they apply to? They ought to apply to all of us equally. And if any of us break the rules of the House and are called out on it and are found by the chair to be in violation of the rules, then we ought to accept that. We ought not have the vote on the House floor to say, well, the rules apply to some people, but not everybody. If the rules are in place, they ought to be in place to be enforced equally. Not that some in power have an exemption and have a free pass to break those rules. So if we're going to talk about what we reject, let's be fair and equal about it. And I would yield.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Madam Speaker, I want to go back to this free market and the minimum wage. The gentleman, Madam Speaker, projects that let the free market operate. We do not allow employers to hire people under a certain age because we want to protect children. I suppose that's interfering in the free market because we know that throughout the world we have 8, 9-year-old, 10-year-old children being asked to work 10, 12, 14-hour days at rudimentary tasks. Perhaps he believes that we ought to have people work 80, 90 hours a week, trying to manage their families and their lives, and not have a 40-hour week, because the free market ought to exercise. After all, the individual can decide whether they're going to work 80 or 90 hours a week. We've known that in our history. Perhaps we ought to have a free market that doesn't worry about whether workers are safe on the job, whether it's in a mine or it's in a factory. We require places to be safe so that we can protect workers. We don't believe that undermines the free market system. We think that improves the free market system. So there
If I could interject, we share that. We share that. That's not an us versus them issue. We agree with those. Obviously, there are some that we disagree with. The ones the gentleman mentioned are things that we agree with. And so when we talk about that...
My point, Madam Speaker...
and I'd yield back. And
I think. My point to the gentleman is that, yes, we think people ought to be paid a decent wage. And we know that there are people in our workplace and in our community have no bargaining power whatsoever. They don't have fancy college educations, they don't have fancy skills, but they are needed in our economy. They're needed to do things that the community needs done. When you go to a hotel, you hope that bed is made up. You hope the bathrooms are clean. When you go to the grocery store, you hope that the peas and corn have been picked. And we believe that those folks are necessary for our community and need to be paid a decent wage, just as we think they need to be safe. I'm glad the gentleman agrees on that. I thought he did. But my point, Madam Speaker, is there is an analogy here to safety, to hours, to working conditions, and yes, to wages. I don't know that the party that the gentleman represents has ever offered an increase in the minimum wage. I'm going to check on that. I don't know. Since I've been here, they have not. It's always been us offering the increase. Now, George Bush, President Bush, to his credit, signed the minimum wage in 2007, which was still less than it was in 1968. As a matter of fact, it's 40% less today than it was in 1968. 40% less workers are being paid. And then lastly, I will say, Madam Speaker, one thing our party agrees with is that men and women have a right to come together and bargain collectively for their wages and their working conditions and their benefits. And they need to be on some degree of parity, because we know big employers and even small employers, you're not on parity. You either do this or don't. And if there are no rules, then people are subjected, in my view and in my observation, to unfair tactics, which they have no defense against other than us. And so I say to my friend, I think he and I agree on hopefully hours, age at which people can work certain hours, on safety conditions in workplaces. I'm not sure about bargaining collectively in unions. I think they're critical to the creation of a middle class and the maintenance of a strong middle class. But we also very strongly believe in the free market system. Now, I could go and pick out one of your members or two of your members who may have some differences of agreement. I won't mention any names, but I can think of some names on your side of the aisle, and I'm sure you can as well, and in fact have. And perhaps disagreement with, from your perspective, some people on my side of the aisle. But we intend to continue to be very supportive of building jobs. You know, I have an agenda I call Make It in America. It's about growing jobs, growing enterprises, helping entrepreneurs, and making sure that people have good wages and good future for them through the free enterprise system. If the gentleman has nothing further, I will yield back.
I'll thank the gentleman for yielding, and clearly if you talk about what makes this country great and the freedoms and the economic success that we've seen for families, businesses, families, for everybody, the reason people come here from all across the world, what we've done to create this great free market system has unleashed potential for anybody to come here and be anything they want to be. I've been proud to help pass policies that have actually increased wages for families, not through government price controls, but through economic growth, through giving people more of their money back instead of them having to come to Washington to get an amount or come to a union boss to get the amount that they can earn. They can actually go do it on their own. And it's playing out in reality, not in theory, but in reality, where we're actually seeing the lowest income workers today benefiting the most from our policies of cutting taxes, not telling people how much they can make, but by letting them go out and make even more on their own, and they're doing it. And it's the lower income people that are benefiting the most from those policies. We ought to encourage more of that. When we see that the unemployment rate amongst African Americans and amongst Hispanics is at the lowest rate in our country's history, not through government controls, but through cutting taxes, letting them have more of their money, and seeing businesses grow and hire more people, seeing more job openings today than there are people looking for work. That's what's so exciting. When you see that women-owned businesses are up 20% over the last few years because of these conservative policies that I've helped pass. So yes, I would say I don't pass when I support right-to-work laws. If a person wants to go work for a company and it happens to be in a union-based industry or a union-based state, and they say they don't want their dues to be forced out of their paychecks to go give to somebody, to go and give them to somebody that believes in things that they don't agree with, they shouldn't be forced to do that. But in many places they are. And so I want more individual freedom. I want more ability for people to go out and live that American dream, to start up their own business in their garage and then one day maybe become a billionaire because there was that opportunity provided to them. Not us telling them how much they can make, but us allowing them in a safe way the ability to go and be the best they can. And I'll use an example because I know the gentleman and I share the belief that people need to be safe in their workplace, and we need to do all we can to ensure that. And you can go look at the deep water drilling in the Gulf of Mexico, which is based out of parts of my district. Port Fourchon in Louisiana is the hub of all that deep water drilling that we saw. And there was a horrible tragedy, the Deepwater Horizon. People died. The environment was polluted. And it was done not because there weren't enough laws in place, but because a company broke the laws. A company went around those safety standards that we put in place, and we went and hammered them. We fined them. I actually passed a bill out of this House in a very bipartisan way called the Restore Act that number one, ensured that they pay billions of dollars back to actually go and fix the damage that they had done, to hold that company accountable for what they'd done, not to shut the whole industry down, because there were every other company that was out there had done things the right way. And then what you saw from the previous administration was a rule that came out called the well control rule that wasn't rooted in safety. It basically said after industry went and did an even better job to put well containment in place so that if something like that ever happened again, they can quickly move to stop it. And instead of government working to help expedite that process, government sat back and waited until industry came up with a better way to solve that problem on their own, and then came up with a rule that actually would have undermined the new safety standards they put in place. Would have actually made it difficult because Washington would have been able to tell them how to manage a well in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico instead of them understanding that pressure changes instantly and they've got to be able to respond to it. Government was setting a standard that actually would have undermined safety. Luckily, we reversed that. So that reversal, that Obama-era rule, would have actually made things less safe. So let's not think that every regulation is about increasing safety. We ought to stand together and support safety standards and strengthen them where we can. But if there's a rule or regulation that actually undermines safety because some people just don't want drilling for oil, some people support the Green New Deal kind of approaches that I don't and many don't. But don't try to undermine safety just to shut an industry down because people don't believe in it. After September 11th, our government came together in many ways, politically, policy-wise, to address what had happened. We didn't shut down the entire airline industry. We made safety standards at airports better so that people that get on a plane feel more comfortable that somebody doesn't have box cutters or a gun or knives that can undermine the safety of those people and of our country. And then we got planes back up and running very quickly. So safety standards are something we both share, but when government gets in the way just because they don't agree with what somebody is doing, that's a different story. And that's the kind of government control versus freedom battle that you're seeing playing out, and you will continue to see playing out, I'm sure, over the next year and a half between now and next November. And I would yield back.
We could go.
If the gentleman had anything else.
We could go for another many minutes. But I'm going to comment on one of the things you said about the person who went to work, wanted to go to work for a company, but didn't want to join the union and the right to work. And the probability is he wanted to go to work for that company because the wages were good, the benefits were good, and safety conditions were good, which the union got. But he or she doesn't want to pay dues to the union. They don't have to join the union, they have to pay dues to the union. I think that's somewhat ironic, but I think demonstrative that when you say these safety regulations, very frankly, you spent a lot of time when you were in charge passing reductions of regulations that we think undermine safety of consumers, of workers, of individuals. We have a disagreement on that, Madam Speaker, but that's what we believe, and that's the tension here that we represent, I think, the attitude that we need to make sure everybody plays by the rules so that people are safe. But in any event, we'll discuss that further, I'm sure, in the coming days and weeks and maybe years. I yield back the balance of my time.
I appreciate the gentleman's comments. I respect our ability to have these disagreements, but again, to disagree in a civil way where we can at least talk about the policy and keep it focused that way, and hopefully one day address those areas of concern that we both share, that we can both solve working together. And with that, Madam Speaker, I would yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman